I found this project by far the hardest as I was taken away from everything I knew. Without any melody or harmony, the only way that I could think of to make the piece engaging was through timbre slash texture and structure. My goal in this piece is to be able to communicate an experience of an anxiety attack to the listener. I've chosen to translate this concept into an engaging musical piece through the use of a narrative structure that keeps the audience wondering how it's going to escalate and what's going to happen next. The primary symptoms of this attack that I want the listener to experience during the piece is a feeling of sensory overload and confusion, alienation with the world, claustrophobia, a shortness of breath, and a sense of panic and fear. The piece begins in relative safety in the classroom, a familiar environment. But once the subject is in the tram, the distortions to reality start, with the voices of the other people on the tram. To alienate the subject from reality, I've distorted every instance of the human voice beyond meaningful recognition using a variety of techniques such as distortion, EQ, and phaser. Then, moving further down the rabbit hole, the sound of birds are heard hovering high above the subject. I intended the birds here to represent the imagination of the subject that they retreat to every day when confronted with the outside world. The birds are layered several times and have delay added to them so that they still sound unnatural. After the birds, and at the halfway point of the piece, I begin to build things to its eventual climax by starting to layer additional voices on to heighten the claustrophobia. As the piece begins the upward trajectory in volume when approaching the final act, I have added in a sample that I took of a baby crying in Melbourne Central, which I've overdriven and frequency shifted. For the final point of the climax, I have put the slamming door of the tram on repeat, and in the final seconds added a frequency shifter to pitch the entire environment up in order to give the audience the most psychologically intense climax I can. To me, satire is being able to tell a serious message through a medium that on the surface seems humorous and light-hearted, so that there comes a moment of catharsis for an audience where they have to question what they've found themselves laughing at when the mask is taken off and the real message is shown. In this piece, I wanted to satirize the government's lackluster response to the virus in the early stages, as well as society's mass panic in response to this lack of leadership. When creating this piece, I wanted to instill an atmosphere of chaos and abrasiveness. However, it was still important to keep the feel and genre in a style that was relatable and accessible to a mainstream audience, so that the effect of ripping off the mask would be most effective. This led me to the conclusion that drum and bass would be the perfect conduit for this message. To further add to the air of anxiety and feverishness, I tapped into elements of industrial and metal music that usually isn't found in D&B, adding distorted guitars and bass into the mix. Producing the drums for this track was extremely difficult for me, as I knew just about nothing going into the task and just had to learn by error mostly. The right samples were very difficult to find, and I still believe that I have not found the perfect samples for the snare and kick yet, as it needs to be low enough to get under the bass, yet punchy enough to kick through the rest of the drums in the mix. I used to think that the producing was 90% of where good drums came from, but I've actually found that the right sample can make an absolute world of difference. The main harmonic landscape of the piece is found within the synth pad, which is playing a progression of C sharp minor, B, A, and G sharp minor. And the bass guitar, which is performing a pedal point based around E flat minor. The downward motion of the harmonic content for me helps articulate a feeling of darkness and hopelessness which isn't portrayed in any of the other parts, so it's particularly useful. It's also voiced quite sparsely, being only the root and the third, partly because of the fullness of the sound design on the synth. It's producing quite a rich sound anyway, but also because this provides an opportunity to expand on these chords later in the arrangement, which I do in the piano in the final section of the piece. I've had to learn a lot about the rhythmic stylings of drum and bass to make this track, and I had to learn a lot of stuff through trial and error. I would recommend that to create the right frantic drum style, the most iconic trademark of the genre, you should create your drums in 3 steps. Firstly, source the right samples and create a strong backbeat on 2 and 4 that you can base the groove off of. Secondly, create additional snare hits in subversive and offbeat positions in the bar that build off of the backbeat. Thirdly, and perhaps most crucially, is employing the use of semiquavers in your kit. The use of semiquavers is what can take your kit from sounding like it's at 170 BPM to sounding like it's at 200, which is really important to nail the sound of the genre. There are a couple of ways that I've found work to achieve the right groove in the semiquavers in your piece. You can either incorporate them as toms or additional percussion, or just add them to your snare as ghost notes. In my piece, I've chosen the latter. I've layered several beat repeats on the snare that all add semiquavers in different places, but with the chance of the repetition occurring at about 20%. What this does is it achieves an effect of randomness and unpredictability, which is in keeping with some forms of D&B. It was a really interesting process to determine the structure of the piece. As I wasn't working with anything predetermined, it was all quite instinctive for me. I borrowed elements from other genres too, as the nature of D&B is quite repetitive traditionally, to ensure as little interruption to the groove as possible, and I wanted more of a narrative structure. For this piece, I considered the experimental and pseudo-improvisatory feeling that film study gave me and decided that I should follow up on this interpretation musically. I performed a 9-minute improvisation on my sax, then, by some lucky accident, I decided that maybe I could create a piece if I duplicated the take many times over and moved them around behind and in front of the original, creating hopefully a massive rich soundscape. Luckily, this was a real moment of creative clarity for me, and it worked out very well, so I set to work on trimming, editing, and processing this idea for the piece. The richness comes from how each part is polyphonic, each voice is separate and independent from each other, and an interesting call and response ends up getting created, through some takes being so close to each other. The tone of the saxophone also creates an atmosphere of noir, which is in keeping with the time period and aesthetic of film study, in my opinion. I include several extended techniques for the saxophone in this piece, for example the use of multiphonics and the altissimo range of the tenor. Positioning in the room was also really interesting to play around with. I found a real intriguing sound was created when I stepped a fair way back from the mic and you could hear a great deal more of the room and the reverberations of the instrument. It was really atmospheric. The nature of the improvisation is such that the harmony is always changing. It very rarely repeats itself and is quite narrative and fluid in its movement. I also added to the piece a drone by looping one note through a delay plugin with the feedback turned past 100% and the resonators set to dissonant intervals. Once the original note had played through, the only thing left is the product of the resonators that is being looped infinitely by the feedback on the delay plugin. The drone evolves throughout the piece, and I affect it more and more and get it more and more complex as it gets slowly affected by distortion, grand delay, beat repeat, and phaser, among others. It reaches its climax as the saxes reach theirs, near the end of the piece, and after that fades with the rest of the parts too. It's interesting to note also how the rhythm is almost cohesive, even though I've applied minimal editing in this facility. Just like the harmony, it is so fluid and linear that there is almost a suspension of disbelief and a trust that the piece can lead you where it wants to go, so you don't really feel the tempo change that consciously. For this project, I had to decide firstly the general timbral direction that I wanted the piece to take. I came to the decision that I wanted to keep the piece very acoustic and write for acoustic instruments with minimal processing involved, as this was in keeping with the style of the animation and the time frame that it appears to be set in. In this vein, I also wanted to use instrumentation that felt period accurate. I wanted to use a lot of music in the piece as well. I saw a really cool opportunity to use music to tell the story as well as the animation, and for both to work in synergy to create the most powerful emotional experience for an audience as I could. In this sense, I interpreted the animation as more of a montage that could work well with music over a large part of it. I took inspiration from a range of sources for this project, including but not limited to Michael Giacchino's incredible score for Up, particularly the track Married Life, as well as the Blasting Company's Patient is the Night, written for Over the Garden Wall. Both use predominantly acoustic instrumentation over an animated montage. However, I drew more from the latter as the smaller ensemble was more representative of what I was trying to achieve. This took me to the quartet that I ended up with of piano, upright bass, clarinet, and baritone saxophone. I felt that for this project, the melody would be an incredibly important tool to convey the emotional message of the animation, and so I worked hard to come up with a melody that was accessible to a wide audience and that would help depict the journey of the characters. The piece features an extensive use of melodic fragments, exploring and resolving themselves quite quickly, which I think is representative of the journey of particularly the grandma in the film. A lot of people read the animation as being nothing but depressing, but I more see it from a tragic angle, where you have a guardian figure who will sacrifice everything for her family, and no matter their circumstances or the hardships they face, their love will get them through, always. It's a beautiful story of familial love, and I feel like rejecting that and portraying it as nothing but hardship and cruelty is not doing justice to the nuance of the thematic material. So I've attempted to capture this unceasing sense of hope through the way the melody is always able to keep resolving itself no matter the dissonance that precedes it. I also felt the dynamic between the two main characters in the animation should be represented in the music. So I scored the piece to have two leading melodic instruments in the baritone sax and the clarinet. As I have explained previously, it was very important to me that the melody should explore and resolve continuously, and I'm very satisfied with how I was able to experiment with this concept harmonically, using a combination of diatonic and chromatic harmony, secondary dominance, and voice leading. For example, the first part of the main progression goes in the key of A flat, the tonic, augmented tonic, to the fourth, to the second dominant, to the fifth. Or at the end, when I use a repeating motif that involves voice leading, connecting A to A augmented to D augmented, and more along the cycle of fourths. I wanted the piece to keep a sense of motion, but not at a fast tempo, so I chose the time signature of 3/4, which to me has an inherent lilt that will work very well. 3/4 also communicates a waltz, which fits thematically as I want the piece to be a dance between the two main characters.